Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. Anti-Semitism is still alive and well and prospering in the United States and around the world. For the 2.5 million Christians around the world who have put their faith in a Jewish man named Jesus, it seems antithetical that they would not be the most vocal of protests against any form of anti-Semitism, but that's not the case. Our next guest tackles this subject in his new book. At age 31, Evan Moffic became the youngest senior rabbi of a large congregation of 1,000+ members in the United States. During his leadership, the congregation became the fastest growing synagogue in metropolitan Chicago. A regular contributor to the Huffington Post and Belief Neck, he has spoken at Willow Creek Community Church, Jewish book festivals in over 100 synagogues, churches, and organizational gatherings across the United States. He's appeared over a dozen times on Fox News as a commentator on social and religious issues and was a guest at President Obama's annual White House Hanukkah party in both 2014 and 2015. A 2000 graduate of Stanford University, he was ordained by the Reform Movement's Hebrew Union College in 2006. He's married to Rabbi Ariel Moffic, and they are the parents of Hannah and Ali. Here to discuss his new book, First the Jews, Combating the World's Longest-Running Hate Campaign, is Rabbi Evan Moffic. Rabbi Evan Moffic, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. It's just a joy to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you. Now, did you grow up in the Chicago area?
No, I was actually born in Houston, Texas. My dad was teaching at Baylor Medical School, and we lived there till I was 11. And then we moved to Milwaukee. My dad's from Chicago, my mom's from Milwaukee, so I have some good Midwestern roots.
So the question always becomes, so what, and I remember going to my father at age 13 after my bar mitzvah, and he says, now that you're a man, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, I want to become a rabbi like my great-grandfather. And his response as a Hungarian immigrant was, what kind of job is that for a Jewish boy? Right? You need to go out and make yourself a living. So I didn't get my smicha until I was 55 years old. It was 42 years later that I actually was ordained as a rabbi. This calling on your life, was this evident as a young boy? Was this something that you felt a longing for in Hebrew school, a longing for in the synagogue? Where did this come from? Was this something that your grandparents instilled in you, or where was it birthed for you?
I think it's a lot. You know, both my father and my grandfather were doctors, and my mom was a teacher. And so I think I grew up with sort of people who were in the nurturing fields and who cared about other people and wanted to make a difference in people's lives. So I think I had good role models in my own family. But I also think the people around me, really, the rabbis I grew up with really were such positive role models. They were scholars, they were community leaders. You know, they were different. One of them was a great preacher. You know, whenever he stood up to give a sermon, everybody listened, and it was always powerful and insightful. The other may not have been the greatest preacher, he was fine, but he was the kind of rabbi who was at your hospital side with chicken soup, you know, an hour after you were admitted. You know, these were people who really cared about others, and I admired that so much. And then I also, just by a fluke, ended up going to a Jewish day school. My parents, we lived right near a public school in Houston, but it turned out it was just an awful school. And so my mom pulled me out, you know, 6 weeks into first grade, and the only school around us that had an opening was a Jewish day school. And so she ended up putting me there, and it ended up being one of the best things in my life. So sort of these fortuitous circumstances kind of brought me in that direction.
Now, was this a Hillel Academy?
No, it was actually a Reform day school, Reform Jewish day school. There are not that many of them.
No.
This was the only reason there was space is because it was brand new. At the time, it was an okay school. It's turned out to become one of the best private schools in all of Houston, but at the time it was sort of a startup, and I just got very lucky.
So your education was more than just the, I remember in my Jewish education, of course, you were raised up to be a mensch. I was raised conservative, but then because of my grandparents who came from the old country, they really were a product of Solomon Schechter, and let's maintain our lifestyle, but let's assimilate only to the point of trying to make a living and trying to fit in to this new world and to escape from the shtetl that they came from in 1904. But then I went to a Reform synagogue and was confirmed, and that's where you learn Jewish ethics. That's where you learned more of the rest of the story, if you will. And back when I was a kid, the Reform synagogue didn't have bar mitzvah. That was instituted, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s. I was bar mitzvah in 1965. So it changed a lot. And, you know, there's always this debate as to within Judaism, you know, the Reform, the Conservative, the Orthodox, the Ultra-Orthodox, the Lubavitchers, the Reconstructionists, the Reformists, the Messianics, all of this thrown in together. Is Jewish a bloodline? Is it a race? Biblically, the Bible only speaks of two races, two people, Jews and Gentiles. And even within the Gentile world, there was the Goyim and the Gerim. And the Gerim were those who pitched their tents with the camp of Israel, and the Goyim were the other people. And we had nothing to do with those people. But the Gerim were those that were kind of grafted into our way of life and joined us as the sojourners in the Exodus. And then we refer to Ruth and to all of that. And we begin to realize that much of our history has been evolving for the last 6,000 years. And, the question is asked is, are you a race? Biblically, we are. There are only two people groups in the Bible, Jew and Gentile. But when you get into this concept of the Greek ethnos, which is a modern construct, where do we fit in that modern?
There's no word for religion in the entire Hebrew Bible. There's no word for religion.
Right.
We were a people, a nation. The whole idea of a religion, as in a set of beliefs that one subscribes to, is modern, right? It does. It evolves. And think about Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. She comes to the land of Israel, and she becomes Jewish, but she never goes through any formal conversion process. She simply lives in the Jewish homeland, in a Jewish family, and essentially becomes Jewish and becomes the, great-grandmother of King David. So I think the way we define Judaism today is very fluid, and it is a very there are a lot of external factors that come into play that aren't really connected to religion. They're more connected to society. So just to give an example, I mean, I think within the wider Jewish community, let's say, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, have had a difficult time having any kind of dialogue with Messianic Jews because people draw that line. I think those lines are changing, personally. I mean, I see it in my own community. There will always be lines, but what they are shifts over time. And I think that's part of the that's part of the sort of evolution is not the right word. It's the way we understand God's word in our time. We have to be mindful of when we live and what God is teaching and revealing to us today.
We have been reviled, but this enmity was created in the oldest prophecy in the Bible in Genesis 3:15. And one of the struggles that I had sitting under amazing rabbis, Solomon Freehoff.
Oh, one of the greats.
Walter Jacob, Emmanuel Feldman, studied, sat with, and was very devoted to these men of God. And I would ask them the question that as I came to the end of 2 Chronicles, And I would go back and say, well, when did this happen, Rabbi? When was the seed of the woman? When did she crush the head of the seed of the serpent? And they would just say, well, you need to go to yeshiva. You need to go on for further study. That's not a question. You need to. And so this was what prompted me to go outside and to look at the forbidden chapter of Isaiah 53 and really to pursue in my own life. Yet I'm Shomer Shabbat. You can't take that from me. You can't take my Jewish identity from me.
No.
It's just, it's impossible. It is my taste buds, my kishkas, my very guts bleed Jewish. My heritage, the Holocaust, going back to Budapest and seeing the shoes, knowing that my own family members' shoes are lining the Danube River. That going to Odessa and looking up in the Holocaust records there in Odessa as to what members of my family, the Aaron Prices, died in the barracks there, who was killed at Babi Yar. For me to have gone to the death camps to find the rest of the story that
felt the connection.
You know, why did my father change our name from Vovovich to Walker? It's because he didn't want us to be received in America as Jewish because of the persecution he had in Hungary as the communists began to come in 1934 and 1935. There were so many things that motivated our people to either blend, assimilate, lose our identity, even become anti-Semitic Jews, which you address in the book.
Yes.
Which I have a friend that's at a conference at Cedar Sinai Hospital right now in the heart business, and last night was at a dinner talking with an anti-Semitic, pro-PLO Jewish doctor that said, listen, if you love the Jews so much, why don't you convert? As if that was something that was...
That's awful.
You know, and you and I contend with this, and we see it, that the people of the book, the land of the book, Israel, has been so maligned. Yet, what's so fascinating to me, Rabbi, is that we talk so much about hate speak in America, but there is no condemnation. Anti-Semitism is excluded from the hate speak narrative.
It's incredible. You know, there are a lot of my fellow rabbis, Jews, who are involved with the Women's March, and there's so much debate now about, well, should we participate or should we not participate? I honestly cannot understand. I try to be empathetic in my job. I have to work with people of all different perspectives, politics. I cannot understand how a Jewish person would participate in the Women's March now. It has been revealed to be deeply anti-Semitic in its origins. I mean, from the very first meeting where they were talking about Farrakhan conspiracies, about the Jews being behind the slave trade. This was at the founding meeting. And so to me, people who are concerned about oppression, are concerned about the persecution of others, simply just, it's almost a reflex to turn a blind eye when it comes to anti-Semitism. And that's partly why I wrote this book, because truly, when somebody doesn't care about anti-Semitism, that means they don't care about a lot of other hatreds, that they're willing to tolerate. There's a true racism that, you know, that underneath a seeming care for others is a deeply racist attitude. And I think anti-Semitism is the clue. Jews are always the miner's canary of history. When people persecute Jews, you know they're going to persecute others. And I talk about that history repeatedly in the book. I mean, it's almost like a given. When a society, look at Germany, when it started, when Hitler came to power and started to persecute Jews, that was the beginning of the end of Germany. And so this same in Spain in the 11th and 12th century. Spain was this prosperous, amazing country. Suddenly the Almohads invade, and there's a battle between Catholics and Muslims. Jews become the target of both. That's the end of the Spanish Golden Age. And this cycle repeats itself.
If you look at Genesis 12:3, which we would call the Abrahamic covenant.
Yes.
It says, I'll bless those that bless thee, I'll curse those that curse thee, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through your family, through your descendants. Now, historically, Every empire that has ever stood against Israel has failed.
Yes.
In our modern day, in my lifetime, I have seen it with my own eyes, because the Soviet persecution of the Jews caused the falling of the Iron Curtain in my lifetime. We
Yes.
saw England, who prior to 1948, all in favor of the Balfour Declaration, all in favor of what we would call a Zionist movement today. The Jews need a homeland. The name Palestine was coined by the Romans, Palestinia Capitolina, as a rubbing our nose in those that persecuted us. It was a Roman way. There's no such place as Palestine. There's no such people as Palestinians. This is something that's been distorted and is not factual. But what is factual is that we saw that in 1947, the global mantra of Great Britain and the British Empire was the sun never sets on the British Empire.
That's right. Not anymore.
1949 began the collapse of the British Empire, because although they made a deal for Israel, they made a side deal with the Arabs. And
Sure.
in 1949 became India and Pakistan, and all of that began to separate, and the empire began to collapse. So we know that God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not just the God of Abraham, which could be called Allah, if you just go to Abraham to Ishmael, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has proclaimed, and we have almost 6,000 years of history, 4,500 years since the time of Abraham, that this covenant blessing has been in place, of the blessing and the curses, but yet historically we've learned nothing from it.
That's
And
right.
some of America's worst years.
Think of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein, his thinking helped create the atomic bomb that won World War II.
Yes.
He was a refugee from Germany. He was a refugee. Germany lost its greatest scientist. You know, there's one positive. You know, I worry, you worry, we worry about the future of our world. Thankfully, the United States remains very pro-Israel.
Yes.
Jewish community, sadly, is splitting. It's really, I mean, you just, your friend and the doctor in Los Angeles, the Jewish community is splitting. The United States as a whole remains very pro-Israel. And I think that symbolizes our strength as a country. When a country is welcoming to the Jewish people, it's strong, it's prosperous, it grows. I mean, look at post-World War II America. And we have to keep that. That's partly why I wrote this book, to remind Americans why Israel matters, why the Jewish people matters, why God blesses those who bless the Jews.
You know, Rabbi, I get asked this question a lot. I would like your take. I will give you my take on it, and then I would like your take. Historically, the Jewish community has voted Democrat and been in support of gay, lesbian rights and in support of abortion. Now, in my generation, that support came for abortion because my Jewish parents did not want my sisters to carry the illegitimate child of the Gentile boy in the neighborhood or the Gentile boy at college, where we were going to have to raise this Gentile boy that was going to take off and leave my Jewish sister pregnant. And so, therefore, in the 70s, Roe v. Wade, there was a support for this, trying to keep from assimilation, trying to keep the Jewish community intact. The family values of Judaism is that family first. Even in modern day Judaism, it's still family first before God first, even though it's to be God first. It's family first, and if my son comes home and says that I'm a practicing homosexual, that it would not be the Jewish way for us to reject him.
That's right.
And that any legislation which would persecute him, we would not be prone to supporting. However, I can look at that as a defense, but if I look at the true practicing Jew who believes in Torah, who believes in the Pharisaical understanding of both the Tanakh, of all of the Tanakh, of the Torah, of the writings, and of the prophets, then it is a modern day, not supported stand from a biblical perspective. And have we gone too far to the sages, to the rabbis, to the Talmudic teachings, and embrace more of the Talmudic teachings than we have of the teachings and the author and the authentic scriptures? And I recall a debate, and this was the debate. Three rabbis are having an argument over whether a Paschal lamb with one gray hair would be considered to pass the test for without blemish or spot. Two of the rabbis say yes, one of the rabbis say no, and they decide, well, how are we going to settle this matter? They say, we'll go to God, we'll ask God to make a decision. God says one gray hair, not without blemish and not without spot, and the rabbis look at each other and say, well, now it's tied 2-2.
Yeah, yes, that's a version of a story called the Oven of Aknai.
Yes.
Yes, very, very similar story. I agree with some of what you said. What I don't agree with 100% is I don't think it's a matter of Talmudic versus biblical. I don't think that modern Jews today are saying, well, we're more Talmudic than biblical. I happen to think that most American Jews are generally pretty secular in their orientation. I don't even think they think much about religion. And so the values that many have are really driven more by the wider culture than any religious basis, be it Talmudic or biblical. And I think some of the democratic inclinations are really somewhat historical, right? I mean, before, let's say the 80s, generally the more liberal political parties were the most for Jewish rights and equality. It was Republican sort of country club establishment that still had anti-Semitic quotas, and it was the liberal Roosevelt kind of folks who were more open to Jewish participation. I think a lot of that reversed after Reagan in the 80s, and Jews really became sort of fully accepted members. But I think there's still a lot of lingering connection to the Democratic Party and associating the Republican Party with sort of the old classical anti-Semitism. And so I think some of it's just cultural rather than really thought through.
Well, I agree with you. I do agree with you. And as I talk with rabbis in Israel, and I go to Israel every year for 2 weeks, I have for the last 16 years. My grandfather was a friend of Ben Gurion, a friend of Abba Eban, a friend of Albert Einstein. And he believed that we were American Zionists, not Israeli Zionists. And so what does that mean? He said, if everybody leaves America and goes to live in Israel, who's going to be left behind to raise money for Israel in America? And so in 1959, he was Israel Bonds Man of the Year. David Ben Gurion came to America to attend the dinner in honor of my grandfather. I was 7 years old. I remember the dinner. I remember the distinguished entourage of elevating my grandfather. And he made a valid point. And so for the better part of my life, I never considered even visiting Israel, but I was involved in fundraising. I was always involved in sending money, but I didn't have the heart. It wasn't really until my early 50s that maybe mid 40s, early 50s, that I got this hunger. And now I'm there every year. I spent 6 months there several years ago and became friends with heads of yeshiva so I could have discussions about, in a circle, in Jewish argumentative style. I had my belief system. I had done my research. I found what I thought to be the truth and was able to defend the truth, and was with those that were not willing to rent their garments and spit on me, but were willing to embrace me and have a real dialogue and explore the text and explore the writings explore Rabbi Kaduri, Rabbi Akiva, Maimonides, just all the way through and have these debates and be received as a peer as opposed to an infidel or to a somebody who had left the tribe, but truly honored me by saying, yes, we'll meet with you, yes, we'll study with you, yes, we'll talk with you, and no, we don't have to agree with you, and we can still walk away loving each other and respecting each other. And I am a respected Jew in Israel, even though I'm Messianic. I'm still a respected Jew because I've done nothing to bring any negative light to my Jewishness. There's no reason for it. I preached my father's funeral when I called Walter Jacob, Rabbi Dr. Walter Jacob, who had known me for over 55 years.
Wow.
And said to him, Rabbi, you know who I am. You've known my family all my life. You know what I believe. My father has passed and my family wants me to do his funeral. Will you give me the pulpit of Road of Shalom? And he said, who am I? I've known you all your life.
Wow.
Who am I to say that you are not, who carries the same smicha I carry, that you are not, after the years of study with me in this congregation, in this city, and what you went on to do in other cities that you lived in, who am I to say that you are not a Jew? I don't subscribe to that opinion, and I'm honored to give you the pulpit here at Road of Shalom in order to preach your own father's funeral. This was a machaya, this was a blessing beyond all blessings.
How long ago was this?
Let's see, 1998.
Wow. Yeah, he was a giant. He's still alive, Walter Jacob, right?
Yeah, 16th generation German rabbi.
Yeah, he's one of the great ones.
I grew up at the feet of Solomon Freehoff. I went to nursery school at the synagogue. There was a secret panel behind the doors that opened up into the rabbis. The way the rabbis came into the pulpit was through these doors from their studies. And they would come in, the doors would open, they'd slip in and take their seats. They never came through the congregation. Yeah. This was the old world Byzantine style. And I would sneak into his office and hide under his desk because I didn't want to go to the nursery school. And Solomon Freehoff, that people said nobody spoke to the man. Right. Walter Jacob, everybody said nobody spoke to the man. I picked the phone and called. He answered the phone himself. Wow. My mother said, I think you're one of the only people that I know in the city of Pittsburgh that's ever spoken to Walter Jacob. He was that highly revered as a scholar and as a writer. Always reminded me of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
Looked like Abraham Lincoln, tall, thin, dark, like Abraham Lincoln, but sweet man, but just was not not like you and I, where we want the kids to run down the aisle and grab our leg.
The old style rabbi.
The old style rabbi.
Yeah.
But what we're seeing is that, we didn't have birthright and taglit, and we didn't have go to Israel, and we had support Soviet Jewry back in the 50s. That was the big mantra, and that was the big push, is to bring our people back from the former Soviet Union and help get millions back to Israel to avoid the persecution of the Cossacks, what we knew from the shtetls and from the persecution. It's interesting because you come from a different generation and from a different time and season, but yet our Jewish identities are identical in the fact that we see anti-Semitism as being a poison.
The shooter in Pittsburgh must have hit you hard then. That's
very hard. Yeah. That's my sister's synagogue. My mother lives around the corner. I walked by there. It was 5 blocks from where I was born, 5 blocks from where I went to elementary school. Was the neighborhood synagogue.
Yeah. When I wrote this book, I started the ideas planted in 2015 because I saw anti-Semitism on the rise, especially from the left, and then as I'm getting ready to release it, this incident happens in Pittsburgh, and it just broke my heart. And it was just so, I think it was a wake-up call. This is a danger not only to Jews. That's one of the larger things. Anti-Semitism is not just about Jews. It's about everybody.
Yes.
And there's a real hatred that is spread, and it's irrational, and we need together, Messianic Jews, Reform Jews, Orthodox Jews, believing Christians, we need to target this. We need to work together. That's why I wrote this.
You know, the Simon Wiesenthal Center has done a great job as being the voice opposed to anti-Semitism, but unfortunately, it's not a popular opinion. The church, even the church that believes in the Jewish man, Yeshua, Jesus, are opposed. They're sponsoring the BDS movement. The Catholic Church is anti-Semitic in its very foundation and believes that they are now the inheritance because Israel turned their back on God and rejected Jesus. But they don't read the same Brit Hadashah that I read that says that everybody who believed in Jesus was Jewish. That
Right.
there was no rejection of, there was a rejection of his authority by those in authority, just the same way that there's a rejection of the Democrats by the Republicans in authority. It's whoever is in authority is going to oppose anybody that's going to challenge their authority. So it's the way of man is that anybody that challenges your power will become your enemy and is going to be in opposition to you. So when we look at any of the teachings of the Rabbi, Jesus, and not put him in his Messiah or Savior mode, still a Pharisee among Pharisees, a teacher, one who challenged the thinking of the day, the same way you and I challenge the thinking of the day. What's going on in Israel today is a subject of great debate, and it has polarized a lot of people because they don't know the truth.
Right.
And there's a great deal of ignorance. And when you take a look at the mantra of the second largest body in the world that says that Allah converted, changed Jews, many Jews into monkeys and into pigs, and that we are labeled as the little Satan and that we are bound for destruction, certainly biblically prophetic in God's proclamation against Ishmael. But these are not Ishmaelites living in New York City. These are not Ishmaelites living in Los Angeles. These are Jews who are coming out against other Jews because of Jewish politics. How do we determine legitimate criticism of Israel, which is a government run by...
It's a democracy. Yeah, there's something I talk about in the book called the 3 Ds test. And this was actually developed by Natan Sharansky, a refusenik who ended up becoming a major political figure in Israel. And he said, you can tell legitimate criticism from illegitimate anti-Semitism if it talks about demonization. So if it demonizes Israel, says Israelis are deliberately killing Palestinian children, which is a charge you see in the media. Israelis are deliberately maiming Palestinians and putting drugs in their water. You see these conspiracy theories all the time, including among some Jewish press. So that demonization is anti-Semitism. Delegitimization, that's when you say, well, you know, Jews are just a religion. They're not a nation, so they really don't warrant a nation state. Sure, Jews can live in Israel, but they should live under an Arab, in an Arab country. That's defining Judaism as anti-Semites would want to define it, not as Jews define it. So there's demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. That's the third D. Double standards is, okay, I'm going to target Israel, but I'm not going to say anything about Saudi Arabia or China or Indonesia or Turkey. I'm going to, the statistics are incredible. The number of people who have been killed in Syria over the last 8 years is triple the number of people that have been killed in all of Israel since 1948. It's like 1% of Arabs killed than in the Arab-Israeli conflict than have been killed in Syria, and yet all the media focuses on is on Israel. And so that's double standards. And that is a deep-seated anti-Semitism, almost unconscious. I think some reporters, maybe the New York Times, other places, they may not consciously be, following these anti-Semitic sort of approaches, but it's there. And there's I do a whole deconstruction in the book about how these ancient anti-Semitic biases still infuse reporting on the Middle East today.
I do a class called Prophecy Revealed, and I take a look at the prophecies of the Old Testament and see how they play out today, the alignments of Ezekiel 38 and 39, Psalm 83, Daniel chapter 9, these things that are converging, various convergences that are taking place in the Middle East right now. And people are amazed that all these things were foretold by God. In many ways, everything is as it should be, because there has to come a point when we as Jews are drawn back to the land, that all of us are going to find the only safe haven for us is going to be in Israel, and God is going to draw his people back from the four corners of the earth. But in the meantime, it's quite uncomfortable. In the meantime, it's quite unbiblical. And the part that bothers me the most is that the agenda of the church in many cases, and there's a resurgence of evangelical support and love for Israel, and that I feed and that I support, and people like former Governor Mike Huckabee, who are staunch supporters of Israel, and I see in Israel on a regular basis, are doing a wonderful thing. But then we have the established Catholic Church, which is rooted and grounded and was complicit in the Holocaust and still believes that they are the only way. And that represents 1.25 billion people in the world that have a predisposition from a theological perspective to not believe in the existence of Israel. Then you have those from the Reformation, the Presbyterian Church that has divested itself of Israel. You have the Methodist Church, which is a very large denomination, discussing divesting itself from Israel. Even the Baptist Church that had been neutral on Israel is now coming out with some statements leaning towards an anti-Israel bias. And this is very disheartening for me, because it's simply stated, anti-Jewish is anti-Jesus. So how can you how can you love the Jewish Messiah and hate the Jewish people?
Well, I think it's such an interesting point. In some ways, the more conservative elements in the Catholic Church have been the warmest towards Israel, which is actually a reversal from, Vatican II was a tremendous step forward in Jewish-Catholic relations. And Vatican II was driven by the more liberal wings of the Catholic Church. Vatican II, now, the more conservative elements are actually the ones that have been the most closely supportive of Israel. I mean, John Paul II was the first pope to visit Israel. He went to the Western Wall. So I think some of the feelings in the Catholic Church actually depend on sort of which wing is in power. Right. There's so many different competing agendas. Fortunately, I think in America, we're lucky. Part of it is good interfaith ties. Generally, the priests that I've been associated with, that I know, they're generally supportive. There are others, though, and you see it in the news, that really have this ancient, awful disdain. And I worry about that. I mean, that's another reason I wrote this, because as you talked about, Jesus was Jewish. And if you want to feel love towards Jesus, you have to feel love towards Judaism.
Well, I absolutely agree with you and support that. We would normally have taken a break, but I just find your subject too fascinating and you too engaging. Would love to have you on even again to talk about this even further. When man sets himself against God, which anti-Semitism is,
yes,
it's setting himself against God. Man never wins. We look at Isaac, Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, and he's the only one to come out of it, but nevertheless he came out of it with a limp.
That's right.
When he was in conflict, but he was wrestling God for a blessing, which is a noble cause, a worthy cause, something that God would honor and continue the overnight tossing and turning in order to see one so devoted to receiving a blessing from God.
One who struggles and lives.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it's a beautiful picture. Without great books like History of the Jews to draw upon, that you and I have read, grew up with, that the writings of Theodore Herzl and some of the great history that we have, without knowing it and looking toward the modern news, I think the modern news is complicit. Most people don't understand that we were relegated in every country that we ever lived in to a diminished position where there were only certain things that we were allowed to do. And so because we were only allowed to do those things, we became quite proficient at those things.
Yes. And banking is an example. I mean, I talk about that, right? Jews were not allowed to own land, and Jews were not allowed to belong to guilds. And that was, and yet every economy needs banking. You can't grow without credit. And so the Jews did develop a proficiency in that. And it was also something that they could do in different locations. So if they left one town, they could help bank in another town. And in fact, in some of my research, I discovered it was actually the Catholic bishops sometimes who wanted a larger Jewish population because they wanted their population to grow, and they wanted wealth. And so they would invite a Jewish merchant into town. But when times got bad, who was the scapegoat? And this repeats itself throughout history. So yeah, so Jews, it's a very interesting kind of history in that regard. And some of that, the early Zionists who built the land of Israel, they were actually wanted to move away from some of those stereotypes. They said, we want to return to the land. We want to return to what we once were, the biblical people. But, you know, what we have been involved in, what we prefer has been shaped by our history, which wasn't always great.
You know, you and I as two Jews talking, and we have an honest view of, you know, why we went into Babylonian captivity. You know, God's saying, you like idols? I'm not going to allow idols in my land, but I'm going to send you. You want idols? I'll give you idols. I'm going to send you for 70 years to a people with idols. You want meat? I'll give you meat till it's coming out of your nose.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, you want things which are opposed to my will. You're still my people. Your children, you have 2 daughters. You have occasions where they go against your will, and therefore there has to be consequences. And so, you want to play with your dolls when you're supposed to be sleeping. Okay, now you have to stay up for 4 days in a row. No, we don't do that, but that might be a God response that they put us to hard labor for that. Yeah. But we have the same history as everyone else has. The only difference is that our history happens to be documented in the best-selling book of all time. And therefore, all the world has access to our history, where we don't have access to the Armenians' history, unless we want to go out and get a book on Armenia. We don't have a book on the Zulu history or the Tasmanian history. But our history is recorded for all mankind in the best-selling book that's ever been, and therefore everybody feels that they have knowledge and an opinion to offer because it's so readily available. I think that it's a perversion of the Word of God to use the Word of God against us, where the origin of monotheism sits squarely on the shoulders of one who himself, Abraham, from the day he left his father's house for 25 years, perpetrated a lie that his wife was actually his sister.
Yeah, that's a A very interesting incident in the Bible. I remember I wrote a whole essay in rabbinical school about the sister-wife motif, which
Yes.
repeats itself. Isaac does the same thing.
Yes.
Um, it's a very interesting legend, and it shows that Jews were targeted early on. There's also this was not an uncommon. This similar story appears in other ancient Near Eastern literatures of the time, but anti-Semitism, that's it. I struggle, and people sometimes just ask this one basic question: why do people hate the Jews? And I struggle because it's this long history, but it doesn't have any rational explanation.
No.
Most Jews live just in harmony with other people like others. We're not more likely to commit crimes or anything. And yet throughout history, this hatred persists. And so I think there must be some sort of spiritual basis for it. And I don't know what we can do to fight that, but we have to be more aware of it. And that's why these conversations we're having are so important, because we know that this matters. We know that God calls on us to fight this hatred of the Jews because it somehow appears in every generation.
Well, in my opinion, it was one of my dissertations was on the seed line and how God had to protect the seed line in order to bring fulfillment and salvation for the Jews, that everything was done. The seed of the woman, seed of the serpent. The only other woman's seed that's mentioned in the Torah is the seed of Hagar, and of course that's Ishmael. And so we know these two seeds grow up side by side, and there's enmity. There's the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, the Ishmaelites, Moab and Ammon, which were the incestuous offspring of Lot. And so we see that there is a conflict that's going to happen, believing that whether you're Nachash or Hasatan or whoever was in the garden, that this prophecy, Genesis 3:15, was spoken over. Here's what's going to happen. Here is who is going to take you out of this world and defeat you. Here is how they're going to do it, but I'm not going to tell you when. And therefore, you have this fallen angel who is now enlisting everybody he can to keep this seed line from coming into existence and wants to defeat God's plan because that usurps his authority on this earth. And I think it continues to play out. If we read in Matthew 23:37 through 39, Jesus even says, I'm not coming back until the Jews call for my return. So I think that there's enmity in that regard, saying if I kill the Jews, then Jesus doesn't come back, or the Messiah doesn't come, whichever you believe. I now know that 20 years after I first started going to Israel, that the Orthodox rabbis I talked to say, you know what, 20 years ago I would have said, you can't be him, it's impossible. But now I tell you, if it's him, I'm okay with it. It's kind of a change in attitude. So there's only about 10% of the Jewish population that even is thinking about a Messiah. But yet there is this messianic prophecy given to us early in Genesis that does set itself on edge against an adversary, one who Job talked about, one who God brings up in the narrative in Genesis 6, all the way through Scripture. We see this arch enemy.
Sometimes in history, sometimes things are seen more clearly, and sometimes they're seen through a veil, right?
Yes.
In certain moments, we get a glimpse of what really matters, and I think that's happening, and we never know. In some ways, we don't know until afterwards. We just have to respond as best we can discern God's will.
How do people get a hold of you online? I know the book is First the Jews, Combating the World's Longest Running Hate Campaign. It is a must-read for every Christian. It's a must-read for every Jew, especially Jews that are prone to being anti-Semitic, that we have, as the chosen people of God, the responsibility for protecting the oracles of God, and that mantle is something that we have carried faithfully even unto death. But how can people reach you? How can they find you?
My website is rabbi.me or Rabbi, Rabbi, Moffic, Moffic.com. They can also email me, Evan, EVAN, at rabbi.me. And I would love to talk with your audience. And I'm so grateful for your having me on.
Well, I'd love to have you back on, and so I'm going to talk to Jason about that. I know he has you on a whirlwind, and during this whirlwind book release, you're going to be in a lot of places. But come February or March, when your schedule slows down a little bit, I would love to continue this dialogue with you, because we have just barely touched the tip of the subject of anti-Semitism being on the rise, and how we together can combat this as a people, as a nation, and as a Judeo-Christian. And we can't call ourselves Judeo-Christian if we don't embrace the Judeo.
That's right. That's right. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Yeah, well, let's talk about, my other book is on the Jewishness of Jesus. So let's talk about that at our next meeting.
That would be wonderful. I look forward to it. May God bless you and keep you. I just pray the Barakot Kohanim over you. And thank you so much for your time, and glad to have you as a part of Revealing the Truth. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.